Hello, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction. So as you mentioned, I work for Pollinator Partnership, and I'm going to talk about supporting pollinators in woodlands today. So let's get into it. Anyone recognize this beautiful flower here on the left for you online?
Trillium.
No, pawpaw. This is a pawpaw flower.
Oh.
So it's one of my favorites. I take a moment to shout it out. All right. With a show of hands, for those of you online, put it in the chat. Who has heard of Pollinator Partnership? Okay, we've got a few hands. Okay, so Pollinator Partnership is the world's largest nonprofit dedicated exclusively to the health of pollinating animals. For 25 years, Pollinator Partnership has supported pollinators through conservation, research, education, and collaboration. Please feel free to visit our website online, pollinator.org. You may come closer. Yeah. And check out our conservation resources and available programs. A lot of good stuff on there. All right, so with another show of hands, who here has heard of NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service? Okay, much more hands, awesome. Okay, so we are working with NRCS to promote pollinators. And so I am a partner biologist, and I work with NRCS in joint capacity to promote pollinators through related support to NRCS staff, producers, partners, and landowners on private lands. So I'm a partner biologist based here in Central New York, but there are other partner biologists available in the Midwest and West. So if you have any friends or family in Ohio or further out west, let me know and I can help you get in contact with them. Okay, so for the topics for today, we're going to do a quick overview on pollinators, the importance of woodlands for pollinators, how to support pollinators in woodlands, NRCS practices that support pollinators, native plants for pollinators, and then lastly, working with NRCS. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. What is a pollinator? A pollinator is an animal or insect that transfers pollen from one plant to another. The movement of pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower is called pollination. Pollination is needed to produce viable seeds, fruits, and the next generation of plants. Here are some examples of some pollinators. So we have bees, flies, beetles, moths, butterflies, wasps, bats, and birds. All right, so we're going to talk about our hardest working pollinators. It's our bees. So it is estimated here in New York that we have 450 bee species. The majority of bees in New York are ground nesting, approximately 57%. The remaining are stem and cavity nesting bees. Of all the bees in New York, approximately 59% are solitary. So that means each female constructs and provides her own nest without the help of others. So this is a solo female or a single mother. So they're working really hard. And then 24% of the bees in New York are kleptoparasitic. So they are not constructing their own nest. They are going to someone else's nest and laying their eggs in there. So this is kind of like a cuckoo bird, but these are called cuckoo bees. And then the smallest group of our bees in New York are social or eusocial, so approximately 17%. So this means there are overlapping generations with reproductive division of labor. So you have some individuals that reproduce and others that work. So two very popular examples of this would be our non-native managed honeybees and then our native bumblebees. Okay, so as you can tell, I'm a fan of bees, so we're going to talk about this a little bit more. So approximately 25% of native bees in the eastern US are a pollen specialist. So a pollen specialist will only collect pollen from one species, genus, or family. This is my favorite specialist. It is the squash bee. And I feel like, especially right now with all of our pumpkins and gourds, we got to give them a shout out. They work so hard. Yesterday I was working on making a pumpkin pie and I thought of this little girl and I'm like, she's working hard. And so here in New York, we have approximately 96 pollen specialists, that's a lot. So here is a small list of plants that would support a pollen specialist. So we have New Jersey tea, which is an amazing shrub. I don't know if you all have heard of New Jersey tea. It was really important during the American Revolutionary War when we didn't have other tea. It was the substitute, so it's pretty awesome. So we have our dogwoods, our trout lilies, our asters, coreopsis, spring beauty, our sunflowers, blueberries, violets, willows, and many, many more. So what is the importance of woodlands for pollinators? Our forests provide early blooming species that our native pollinators depend on, especially our queen bumblebees. If you're a fan of bumblebees, it's really important. So in our woodlands, we will find spring ephemerals, so our early blooming herbaceous flowers, so like our trout lilies, trillium, spring beauties, all those gorgeous wildflowers you see early spring. And then in the woodlands, we also find a lot of our early blooming trees and shrubs, which is really important because as you know, like if you're looking outside, your meadow typically does not have a lot of flowers early in the year. So if you look in your woodlands for its edge, that's where you're going to find a lot of your early blooming species. And they're really good at filling the gap and providing pollen and nectar throughout the entire growing season. Oh, excuse me. Many of our native moths and butterflies depend on trees and shrubs as a larval host plant. So when I say that, I'm meaning leaves for caterpillars. So our caterpillars, they need leaves. So if you like moths and butterflies, we need to support them during their larval stage, so when they're a caterpillar. And then lastly, but far from least, pollinators support plant diversity. So a diverse community is more productive, healthier, and will cycle nutrients much more efficiently. So why am I focusing on woodlands today, if that other slide wasn't enough? So here in New York, 61% is forested. And of that, 76% of it is privately owned. So New York forest owners, land managers, and conservation planners and professionals are uniquely positioned to help pollinators in New York survive and thrive into the future. Okay, so here is a really fun illustration on how the woodlands can support pollinators. So number one is the soil. The soil provides ground nesting opportunities for our native bees. So worldwide, approximately 70% of bees are ground nesting. Here in New York, 57%. The other 30% worldwide are stem and cavity nesting. So a woody log or the cavities in a tree provide awesome nesting opportunities for them. The forest floor, as I mentioned before, we have our spring ephemerals and then our other flowering herbaceous species you'll find that will provide early season pollen and nectar, mid or late, depending on the species. The same for flowering trees and shrubs. Awesome opportunity for early sources of nectar and pollen, mid and late, depending on the species. Really great at filling the gap of pollen and nectar. Branches, an awesome location for a cocoon or a chrysalis for a moth or butterfly, a nice safe location for them to pupate. And then the leaf litter. So awesome opportunity for overwintering, egg laying, and cover from predators. So even in our backyards, you definitely want to resist the urge of mulching or burning leaves because you're likely killing native pollinators. So if you got to get rid of leaves, maybe relocate them and resist the urge of shredding and burning. Okay, so the importance of pollinators. So number one, pollinators provide vital ecosystem services to crops and wild plants. Over 80% of the world's blooming plants require a pollinator for successful reproduction. Up next is pollinators contribute $308 to $439 million per year to New York's economy alone. I have a picture of apples here because the state of New York ranks second nationally on apple production, and we would not have that without our pollinators. Pollinator diversity equals plant diversity. This is how I fell in love with pollinators. I was more on the plant side and eventually came over to the pollinator side. So if you're a big fan of native plants, you got to support your native pollinators too, and vice versa. The fruits and seeds created from successful pollination provide food for wildlife. So like our berries are supporting our bees, bears, all the critters out in the woods. And then lastly, our pollinators are also a food source for wildlife, especially for birds. Birds really depend on soft body insects to rear their young, and caterpillars are the perfect part of their diet. So if you want to support your birds, support the caterpillars. Okay, and now the sad, depressing news. Pollinators are in decline. Both managed and native pollinators are facing pressure from invasive species, pathogens, loss of habitat, and improper use of pesticides. According to the Empire State Native Pollinator Survey, approximately 38% of New York's native pollinators are at risk of extinction. Under worst case scenarios, 60% may be at risk, which those numbers are really high. The report also found that flies and bees were the groups among the greatest proportion of species at risk, which is extra alarming because, as I mentioned before, bees do most of our pollination work, and flies are really efficient pollinators for a lot of our early spring blooming species. The first slide with a picture of the pawpaw, flies and beetles are really good pollinators for pawpaw. So I don't know if you all have pawpaw or you're a fan of pawpaws, you gotta support those pollinators and enjoy that delicious fruit. Okay, so how can we help pollinators in our woodlands? Number one, remove invasive plants. But if you're going to use pesticides, make sure you're doing so responsibly. We need to try to reduce deer browse. And then we want to choose native plants, which is my favorite way to support pollinators. So you want to select native plants that are going to support our native caterpillars. Select native plants that are going to support our bees and other beneficial insects. So it's going to be a flowering tree and shrub that provides pollen and nectar. And then lastly, if we're wanting to go the extra mile, we need to select trees and shrubs that will support a pollen specialist. So the pollen specialist will only collect pollen from one species, genus, or family. And fortunately, this is where NRCS comes in. So the Natural Resource Conservation Program provides voluntary cost share programs to support your conservation goals. And they can provide financial and technical assistance to tackle these issues. And we're going to talk about those today. Okay, so we're going to start with number one. We're going to talk about why invasive plants are no fun. So number one, invasive plants can affect species composition. So they can displace our native species, they can threaten our rare and endangered species, and they can negatively impact the food web. So this is a good reason to highlight just because a plant blooms and provides forage, it does not make it a good plant. A popular example would be autumn olive. I know early in the spring, you'll see that it's covered in bees and it provides all this rich nectar and pollen, but what it's doing, it's displacing our native species and it's creating a feast or famine. So while it's in bloom, okay, fine. But when it's no longer in bloom, what do the pollinators have to eat when all the native plants were displaced? So, get rid of it. It's a really bad invasive. Up next, invasive plants can also affect the forest floor. So they can decrease litter depth, they can impact microbial composition, and they can change the nitrogen and carbon dynamics in the soil. For example, Japanese stiltgrass and Japanese barberry can increase nitrogen leaching into the soil, which then can negatively impact our water quality. So another great reason why to get rid of it. And then lastly, invasive plants can also have a social impact. So they can lead to a decrease in tourism. The cost control can get more expensive and more difficult the longer the invasive plant is established and grows. And then probably one of the biggest concerns is that it can increase non-native pests. A great but horrible example is the spotted lanternfly. The spotted lanternfly is a big fan of tree of heaven. So if you have tree of heaven on your property, try to get rid of it. Getting rid of the tree of heaven will help protect our nursery operators, fruit growers, especially our grapes. So if you're a big fan of wine, that's an extra good reason to kick them out, and also to help protect our Christmas tree growers. So a study in Pennsylvania back in 2019 estimated an annual direct economic impact of $42.6 million statewide from spotted lanternfly damage. And so that was back in 2019. With inflation, it's probably much greater now. So that's, if you want to protect our native plants and our growers, get rid of tree of heaven to help slow down the spread of spotted lanternfly. Okay, so if you decide to use pesticides on your property, make sure you're using them responsibly. Use an integrated pest management IPM strategy and only utilize pesticides when other management practices have failed to yield results. So for example, if you have garlic mustard on your property, it's a plant that rips up really easily. Maybe try to use mechanical methods first before going straight to a chemical option. Always avoid spraying those undesirable and invasive plants while they're in bloom. This will help decrease the likelihood of a pollinator ingesting or transporting treated pollen back to the nest. So if you're getting rid of that nasty autumn olive, do not spray it while it's in bloom. You're doing much more harm than good. And then always be cautious with systemic pesticides. These can impact pollinators that forage on any part of the plant. Since it's a systemic insecticide, it affects the entire plant. So it'll be in the leaves, the stem, the pollen, and the nectar. And another thing to keep in mind, if you are purchasing a plant from maybe a hardware store or somewhere that's not a native plant nursery, always check the tag and confirm it is not treated with a systemic pesticide, as that pesticide will leach from the plant, go into the soil, and then an untreated plant can take up that chemical, and now you're going to have more plants treated. Yes?
I think the best rule of thumb is don't use any pesticides at all.
Yeah, it is tough.
They're gonna get in their environment. They're gonna get into drinking water.
Yeah.
If you have an infestation of whatever it is, you can just let it die. Another alternative is if the creature can survive the winter, is use detergent, although that's not great, but it will kill them. They won't survive the winter.
Which insect are you, or?
Dishwashing detergent.
Oh, on which plant?
Well, you can do it. I never did it, but we had Japanese beetles, but they just somehow worked themselves out. I put some what's it called? Diatomaceous earth. Okay. It's a white powder and it's non-toxic, but it'll kill bugs.
Yeah, it's really nice because it's a diatomaceous earth is an old fossilized microorganism. It has all these sharp edges. So whenever an insect goes across it, cuts them but that's IPM. So you're using what is needed for the situation. You're not going straight to a hard chemical if you're tackling something. You want to use IPM. There are some invasive plants that unfortunately you do need to use a type of herbicide to eliminate it. But if you're using it very selectively and very carefully.
Like you said, though, you can try other methods.
Exactly. Yeah, I've heard that I love it's a hammer is a great tool, but it's not the answer for everything. So don't go to the hardest tool you have in the shed. Try something easier, softer, and then work your way there. Yes, thank you. All right, so always follow the label directions and give special attention to the environmental hazard section of the label. And if you are using herbicides, make sure you are applying as close as possible to the targeted plant to reduce/minimize drift spray. So here are some common invasive plants that you may run into your woodlands. So these are the woody species. So we have tree of heaven, multiflora rose, autumn olive, privet, common buckthorn, bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle, Morrow honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, Japanese barberry, what's unique about this invasive plant is that it creates the perfect environment for ticks. So if you have a concern of ticks and Lyme disease, that's an extra reason to get rid of it. All right, and then Asian bittersweet, which is the really aggressive vine that some of you may have dealt with. It's really difficult to control. And then grapevine depends on the species because there's still native and non-native species in grapevine that you can find here. All right, so then here are some common herbaceous invasive plants that you may run into. So we have garlic mustard, which that one is nice that you can rip it up by hand very easily. Swallowwort, and a very aggressive invasive species. Lesser celandine, which that is the image here on the right. We have Japanese stiltgrass, mugwort, poison hemlock, Japanese knotweed, kudzu, wild parsnip, which watch out for this one. If you get the sap on your skin from wild parsnip, it reacts in the sun and it will burn you. So if you are trying to remove invasive plants, mechanically with your hands or anything, make sure you are wearing gloves, long sleeves, protect yourself. It does not play nice. And then mile a minute, another aggressive vine. Okay, so if you decided to work with NRCS, so the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they have financial and technical assistance to support you tackling these invasive species. So if you are working with NRCS, there are two common conservation practices that they would use to tackle them. So there's brush management, so that would be for the woody species. And then for the herbaceous species, it would be the herbaceous weed treatment. And then the code, so 314 is just their practice code, and 315 is also their practice code. Okay, so number 2, reducing deer browse. So yeah, deer are fun. So here is a deer exclusion area in Pennsylvania. And as you can see, the area without deer, it's much lush, very green, has a lot of biodiversity, versus on the right with deer, not a lot of green, not a lot of diversity. Looks like maybe we have some hay-scented fern, maybe some grasses or sedges, and not too much else. So diversity, not great. So why do we want to control deer browse? So deer prefer native plants over non-native plants, unfortunately. But of course, you might have some flowers in your garden that are non-native. They're also going to like those. But unfortunately, deer do not like our very aggressive invasive species that we are battling. It'd be awesome if they loved Japanese knotweed and helped us battle it, but they don't. So they're not working with us, unfortunately. So, and then deer can also benefit certain invasive plants. So for example, Japanese stiltgrass, garlic mustard, and tree of heaven can be spread easier with heavy deer browse, unfortunately. So in summary, an increase in deer browse will lead to a decrease in native species, which then could lead to an increase in non-native species. So what can you do about them? Well, you have pretty much two main options. You can either hunt, or you can try using fencing. So if you're working with NRCS, they would use access control, practice code 472, and would utilize fencing to keep them out of woodlands or streams. But keep in mind, deer can jump. So the location and the height of the fence will play a factor in its success. Okay, and my favorite way to support our native pollinators is to choose native plants. Why do we choose native plants? Native plants attract and support more native pollinators, and native plants are naturally adapted to local soils, climates, and conditions. So this means less time, less management, and more money, which is good. All right, so selecting native plants. So we want to select native plants, so trees and shrubs that are needed by our native caterpillars. We want to select the flowering native trees and shrubs that will support our bees and other beneficial insects. And then if we're looking to go that extra mile, which we should all try every now and again, is to select trees and shrubs that will support a pollen specialist. And so a pollen specialist only collects pollen from one species, genus, or family. And always, 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 no matter what, select trees and shrubs that correspond with your site. So make sure whatever species you select is going to thrive in your soil, the moisture that's available in your soil, and the sunlight availability. Don't try putting maybe a willow that loves water into a very dry area. You're wasting your time and your money, and you'll slowly watch the willow die, which is depressing for everyone. All right, so we're going to start at A, and we're going to talk about the trees and shrubs that are going to support our native caterpillars. Okay, so researchers have found that woody plants supported more species of moths and butterflies than herbaceous plants, and that native plants support more Lepidoptera than introduced woody ornamentals. So Lepidoptera is a fancy word for moths and butterflies. So here is a list of that ranks vascular plants in the Mid-Atlantic region by their ability to support moths and butterflies as a host plant. And when I mean a host plant, I mean leaves for caterpillars. So here is the top 10 genera. So number 1, we have Quercus, which is our oak species. 2, we have Salix, which are our willows. 3, Prunus, so cherry and plum species. Betula, so our birch species. Populus, so our poplar species. Acer, which are maples. Vaccinium, which are our blueberries. Malus, crabapple. Alnus for our alders. And then Caria, which are hickory species. Here on the right is the top 26 genera that support moths and butterflies. I'm not going to read through all of them. We're just going to focus on the top 10 today. But as you can see, a lot of our species support a lot of caterpillars. So there's always a tree or shrub out there that will correspond with your woodlands or your backyard. So there's always options. Okay, so we're going to start at number 1, so our oak species. So here in New York, we have around 30 native species. Common examples include the white oak, the swamp white oak, scarlet oak, and scrub oak. So our oaks are supporting 518 native Lepidoptera, which is massive. And although oaks are wind pollinated, bees are known to stop by to collect pollen. And this is, just for 2 examples, it is the host plant to the Polyphemus silk moth and the Io moth, which are really beautiful moths. And so those weird, they look like eyes, and that's to scare predators because they flash their wings real quick, and that hopefully the bird or whoever's wanting to eat them is startled enough that they have time to get away. All right, up next, we're going to talk about our willows. So here in New York, we have over 20 native species of willow, which is amazing. So common examples are our sage leaf willow, pussy willow, heartleaf willow, silky willow, and autumn willow. So our willows are supporting 440 native Lepidoptera, so moths and butterflies. And they also support pollen specialists. And what's extra amazing about willows is that they provide pollen and nectar. So they are an amazing shrub to add to your property for an early source of pollen and nectar. And it is the host plant to the morning cloak butterfly. So a fun fact about this butterfly is that it overwinters in leaf litter and tree bark. So another great example on why not to disturb the leaves, because you could likely be hurting our friend here, which you'll see, this is probably one of the first butterflies you'll see in early spring because they're overwintering as an adult. So you'll see them pretty early in the spring, and they're really pretty. All right, up next we have our cherry species. So here in New York, we have about 9 native species. Common examples are American plum, fire cherry, wild black cherry, and choke cherry. And they are supporting 429 native Lepidoptera, which is still a lot. And they are highly attractive to bees as they provide pollen and nectar, and is the host plant for the red spotted purple butterfly. They went really out with that name. Does anyone recognize the invasive plant that the butterfly is hanging out here on the left? Autumn, I think that's what I heard. Yeah. Just testing your guys' plant ID. You passed. Good job. All right. Up next, we have birch or betula species. So we have 11 native species and subspecies here in New York. So common examples that you probably see much more often are yellow birch, black birch, paper birch, and gray birch. And they are supporting 400 native Lepidoptera. So birch is a wind-pollinated species, but the bees are still stopping by to gather a little bit of pollen. And it is the host plant for the lettered habrocine, which is this pretty moth right here. So habro meaning pretty or delicate, and I think sign, meaning waves or lines. I can't remember, but I'm assuming it has something to do with the decorative design on the wings. Very gorgeous moth. I'm a fan. All right, up next we have poplar species. So we have 8 native species and subspecies here. So common examples are the balsam poplar, eastern cottonwood, big-tooth aspen, and quaking aspen. And they are supporting 358 native Lepidoptera, and also another wind-pollinated species, but they still provide a little bit of pollen to our bees. And it is the host plant to the modest sphinx moth. Very pretty. I love it. Let's see here. All right, so maple species. So we have 6 species here in New York. Ones you'll most likely see are the red maple, silver maple, and sugar maple. And they are supporting 287 native Lepidoptera. And then fun fact of the day, the red maple and silver maples provide pollen and nectar for pollinators. So if you're looking for an early source of pollen and nectar to add to your property, your woodlands, those are great options. And maples are the host plant to my favorite moth, the rosy maple moth. Yeah, it looks like a little plush toy. But yeah, you'll see them early in the spring, so definitely look for them. Oftentimes, if you have like a white house, you might see them like hanging out on the side of the building, on the door frame. Keep your eyes open for them, take pictures, send them to them. It's my favorite moth. All right, so now we're going to talk about blueberry species, so Vicinia. So there's over 10 species here in New York. Common ones are common low bush blueberry, high bush blueberry, velvet leaf blueberry, and hillside blueberry. And they are supporting 286 native Lepidoptera. So still an amazing amount. And a fun fact about bumblebees is that they are an extremely efficient pollinator for blueberry, as they can perform buzz pollination. So what they do, they'll grab hold of the flower and just vibrate. And that releases the pollen grains at the top of the flower, so that way it can gather it and take it home to its nest. And it is the host plant for the snowberry clearwing or hummingbird moth, and you'll see why it's called that. It's both those things. So it's a lovely, and it's one of the few moths that you'll actually see during the daytime. So that makes it extra special. I know when I was young, when I first saw one, I thought it was a baby hummingbird. But now as an adult, I'm like, oh, that's silly, but it looks like it. So it's close enough. But yeah, it's amazing. All right, so crabapple. So we only have one native species here in New York. It is called the wild crabapple or sweet crabapple. It's also an early bloomer, generally March through June. It smells amazing. It's really attractive to pollinators, and it can support 284 native Lepidoptera. And it is the host plant to the tulip tree silk moth. And yes, it also likes tulip trees, but yeah, it's a very massive moth. It's gorgeous. I hope you all get to see one. All right, up next we have alders. So there's, I think, around 3 or 4 native species, but the only 2 that you'll likely run into are the speckled alder and smooth alder. So they can support 248 native Lepidoptera. And it's also one of those wind-pollinated species, so no nectar, but it's still supporting our pollinators with a little bit of pollen. And it is the host plant for the imperial moth, which also the caterpillar first, because I think the caterpillar is amazing. And so what's unique about it, you think this is the face, but it's not. This is actually the rear end. And this side is the face. And so it does that, so that way if a predator is coming for them, it will attack the back and not the front, so hopefully it can get away. But I'll show the moth as well, as adult form. So here is the female, so beautiful. It looks like beautiful fall leaves. And then here is the male, also very pretty. And then, so a fun way to learn to ID the difference between a male and a female is to look at the antennae. So if you look at the female, the antennae is much more skinny. And then if you look at the male, it's much more fluffy and larger. So if for some reason you're outside, you want to know, just look at the antennae. All right, so number 10, so the last one, I know, boo, is hickory. So Caria species. I think there's only 4 or 5, but the common ones you'll run into are bitternut hickory, pignut hickory, shagbark hickory, and mockernut hickory. And they are supporting 233 native Lepidoptera. It's still another one of those wind-pollinated species, but our bees can still stop by to collect a little bit of pollen. And it is the host plant for the hickory hairstreak butterfly. That cutie there. And it's called a hair streak because you can look back here and you kind of see like the hair streak. So that kind of helps with ID. But yeah, it's a very small butterfly, very cute. Okay, so we have talked about the plants to support our native caterpillars, and now we're going to move on to talk about flowering trees and shrubs to support our bees and other beneficial insects. Oh, okay. So who likes a good plant quiz? You guys are plant pros. What do we think? Okay, what's top left? What are we thinking? Very good. Serviceberry. Yep. Okay. What's moved towards the right? Nope. No. It's a tough one. So it's a type of holly. Oh. Yeah. So ilex. So it's a very diverse group. It's very difficult. Winterberry. Yes, winterberry. Very good. All right. So what about here in the middle? Native hydrangeum. No. It's a viburnum. It's hobblebush. Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's a tricky one. So it's called hobblebush because apparently it would trip people in the woods. I didn't choose the name. Yeah, you can't walk through it. That's yeah. What's beside it? New Jersey. Hey, very good. All right, and then the far right, it's another tough one. Oh, it's a type of ilex. So it's one of the hollies. I also don't know which species. I was hoping one of you could help me today. All right, so what about this one? This is a tough one. Yes, oh, very good. Okay, I thought that was difficult. All right. Well, what about right beside it? Down or up? Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, you're right. Let's go up first. The smaller one towards.
For Zoom, right, which one are you at?
Well, you need to describe it.
Oh, So
second from the left,
yeah, the middle row.
Sort of star shape.
Yeah, looks maybe like a dogwood.
Is it a dog?
It's a dogwood.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, so we're gonna move on from the dogwood towards the right, another small one. The purple flowers.
Flowering raspberry.
Very good. So the species name for it is odoratus, which means it smells good. I'm assuming it smells good. I've never actually smelled it, but I'm like, all right. And then, all right, so beside the raspberry is my favorite shrub. It's very round, but very good. So it's awesome. All right, so then one more towards the right. Very good, very good. All right. All right, so now we're going to move over to the large one on the, or no, we already did that one.
Yeah, we did that.
So next over towards the right that has a little bee on there. It's a tough one.
See the leaves, it looks like some kind of cherry.
Nine bark, very good. So that's a very good point. So if you are taking photos and you want to send it for identification, include more than just the flower like I did, because it makes identification really difficult. You want to include the leaves, the buds if possible, and the bark or the stem, because that really helps with identification. All right, so next over towards the right from the nine bark. And steeple bush, yep, spirea, very good. And then the last one on the far right. Hey. A+, everyone. Good job. That was fun. Thanks, everyone. All right. So here are some additional flowering trees and shrubs. So here is the common name. Here is the scientific name. I always like to try to include both, especially if you are shopping, because, you know, there's a lot of common names for one plant. So it's very good to try to include that if you can. And as you can see, each of these species will vary in its shade tolerance. So intolerant, do not put it in the shade. Intermediate, it'll be all right. And then, you know, tolerant, it's fine. It likes it. You'll see that they also vary in soil moisture. Some have like a larger range, some not so much. And then you can see that the bloom time will also vary. So American plum blooms very early in the year, which is fantastic. And the same with the other species. Spice bush a little bit later in the year, May through June. Pawpaw, if you have it, is April through May. So yeah, a lot of different options. Other than, yeah, right here is, I think this is the red maple. And then over there, oh, sorry. So far left is red maple. Bottom right-hand corner is a pawpaw flower. And then the top right is spice bush. So a fun fact about the pawpaws is why the leaves or the petals are that dark, almost looks like a rotten meat color, is because they are trying to attract fleas and beetles to pollinate them. So they're stinky and they're, you know, not the prettiest color because they're trying to attract those very particular pollinators.
Flies?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, flies and beetles, not fleas. All right, so additional flowering trees and shrubs. So there's a whole bunch. So the alternate leaf dogwood is a very fun tree to find because most dogwoods have opposite leaf arrangement. So if you're looking at the stem, the leaves will be going off the same side, so opposite, opposite, opposite. But this dogwood apparently doesn't follow the tree ID manuals, and it has alternate leaf arrangement. So it's really fun to stumble into that one in the woods. So we have American plum, we have arrowwood, which is a viburnum, black elderberry, black gum, buttonbush, still my favorite, common winterberry, flowering raspberry, gray dogwood, the blueberries, maple leaf viburnum, nannyberry, northern bush honeysuckle, which is a native honeysuckle. We have our pussy willow, our serviceberry, silky dogwood, swamp rose, and winterberry. Who here has heard the dark story of serviceberry? Anyone? You've heard it? Okay. Yeah. The dark story. Okay, yeah, and moving on. No, just kidding. So serviceberry, how it got its name, from what I've been told from a dendrology professor back in grad school. Not sure if he's messing with me, but I checked Google and it was also on there. But it was called serviceberry because apparently back in the day, whenever those long, harsh winters, if you had folks pass away during the winter, the ground was too hard to bury them. And so whenever the serviceberry was in bloom, you knew that the soil was soft enough to bury the deceased. And that's how it got its name. Yeah, because you're actually able to have your funeral service for them. Yeah, so a sad fun fact of the day. So. All right, so if you are interested in learning more about native trees and shrubs that are in New York, there's this beautiful handout right over here, Lou's showing to everyone. I have about 30 copies, so there's definitely more for all you to take one home, hopefully. And if not, I will gladly send you a digital copy. This is not the final version. It's still under review. So you might stumble on a few maybe typos or anything. So let me know. I'll have you make edits and updates as needed. Okay, so now we've talked about supporting our native caterpillars, our beneficial insects, and our bees. And now we're going to move on to our pollen specialists. I feel like you all have this down pat by now. So only one species, genus, or family the pollen specialist will gather pollen from. Okay, so there are a few species here in New York that are really beneficial at supporting our pollen specialists. So we have our willows, which support 14 species, our blueberries, 10 species, dogwoods, 5 species, holly, 4 species, staggerbush, 4 species, mountain laurel, 3, New Jersey tea, 2, and redbud, 1 species, but I think technically redbud is not native to New York. So your dealer's choice. All right, so if you are wanting to learn more about the pollen specialist, here are 2 fantastic resources I would strongly recommend that you check out. So the top one was created by Cornell and the Cornell Botanical Garden, and it provides information on creating a pollinator garden for native specialist bees. So it's going to focus on both the woody species and herbaceous species. Yeah.
Is there another common name for New Jersey tea?
Not that I'm aware of, but there probably is. That's why it's definitely important to provide those scientific or Latin names. There probably is. But yeah, New Jersey tea is native to New York. And then here's another resource. So this is Doug Tallamy, or no, excuse me, Sam Droege and Jared Fowler created this. And so it provides information on the pollen specialists themselves. So if you want to learn more about those bees, definitely check out the website. So whatever browser you use, just type in Jared Fowler, pollen specialist bees, and it'll pop up, and it's divided by Eastern US and Western US. So just make sure you're looking at the right one. Okay, so we're back to NRCS. So if you are wanting to add those trees and shrubs onto your property, here are some of the main conservation practices that they would utilize. So we have the tree and shrub site preparation and tree and shrub establishment. Those practices are used together. So preparation, so that's prepping the soil for it, and then establishment is actually planting them. And then a hedgerow planting is another great option to add those trees and shrubs onto your property. All right, so now you're wondering, what other additional practices can I use to support pollinators? Well, we have edge feathering, thinning, riparian forest buffer, and pollinator planting, which is one of my favorite ways to support pollinators outside of the woodlands. Okay, so here is edge feathering. So this is done by creating a gradual transition or edge between 2 habitats. So typically that would be between a forest and a cropland. It is accomplished by either cutting existing vegetation, so some trees, and or by planting native shrubs, wildflowers, and grasses of various heights into the edge. And what's great about it is it provides shelter and food for wildlife. All right, so what are some common native plants would we use to create edge feathering? So for native wildflowers, we have Joe Pyeweed, goldenrod, partridge pea. You could use foxglove beard tongue, or was the hairy beard tongue, black-eyed Susans, false sunflower, bee balm, or wild bergamot. Mountain mint and New England aster are all great options. Excuse me. For native grasses, you can have the little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. For some native shrubs, they're maybe a little bit shorter. We have wild plum, arrowwood, serviceberry, which is a lot of different serviceberry species around. Hazelnut, I think we have about 2 different species, and then our elderberries. And then for some native shrubs, they're just a little bit taller. We have our dogwood, crabapple, hawthorn, and black chokecherry. And yeah, here's a nice larger illustration of it, so you can see like the different various heights. We got a little bit shorter, a little bit taller, and then taller. Then don't forget, we got our logs. You can't forget your fallen logs. All right, so if you are wanting to create this practice on your property, you would use Upland Wildlife Habitat Practice Code 645. So it's a great option. Okay, so another option that you can do is thinning. So this is a forest management practice that involves removing trees or shrubs to improve forest health and to promote tree growth. It can also improve light levels on the forest floor and promote additional plant diversity, especially in a closed canopy forest that lacks understories and midstories. So if you wanted to do this practice on your property, it would be forest stand improvement. And I won't say that code because I feel like that's bad luck, but I don't know who chose that, but they had a choice. So we'll move on from that. All right. So riparian forest buffer. So what's great about this is that it can support terrestrial and aquatic habitat by reducing the transportation of sediments and chemicals, creating shade to help keep the stream temperatures to support those aquatic organisms, and it can increase the diversity of riparian plant communities. So yay, biodiversity. And by selecting flowering trees and shrubs in these riparian buffers, we can provide additional support to our pollinators. So here are some great examples of some trees and shrubs that would do really well in a riparian area. So we have our American plum, our arrowwood, our black elderberry, black gum, buttonbush, still amazing, common winterberry, gray dogwood, pussy willow, our serviceberry species, and silky dogwood. These amazing photos are from the USGS bee inventory and monitoring lab. They take amazing photos. If you ever want to see some amazing photos of plants, bees, insects, definitely check out their website. But yeah, the USGS bee inventory and monitoring labs photos. But yeah, if you just Google it, Yahoo it, whatever browser, it pops right up. Okay, so if you wanted to add a riparian forest buffer onto your property, it would be the riparian forest buffer practice code 391. Oh, and there's that butt bush again. As you can tell, it's one of my favorites. All right, so if you are wanting to support pollinators outside of the woodlands, the great option is a pollinator planting. So this is typically done in a meadow or an abandoned crop field. So to best serve pollinators, you want to select a diversity of wildflowers that will vary in size, shape, color, and bloom period. At a bare minimum, you want to select at least 3 species per bloom period. So 3 in the early, 3 in the mid, and 3 in the late. So early in the year, middle of the year, towards the fall. And to provide a continuous source of pollen and nectar. We don't want to create a feast or famine. We want something to be available all during the growing season. And then by adding native bunch grasses, such as little blue stem, is a great way to provide nesting and overwintering opportunities for bumblebees, and is also a larval host plant for some of our butterfly species, such as skippers. So that's a great way to support them. I don't know if you guys have seen skippers. You'll probably see them literally skipping around when they fly. Very cute. All right, so what are some common species that you would see in a pollinator planting? So we have our milkweed species. So the photo here on the right is swamp milkweed, which is amazing. Smells like cotton candy. I don't know if any of you smelled it. Definitely worth smelling. Bee balm or wild bergamot, which also smells amazing. We have our goldenrod species, which we have plenty of different species to choose from. Species of beard tongue, little blue stem. So that's that bunching grass, which is really important to add to your pollinator planting. We have our mountain mint. We have our ironweed species. So here in New York, we have the giant ironweed and then the New York ironweed, both really pretty. We have common yarrow, which can sometimes get a little aggressive. So definitely something to keep an eye on. So if you don't like it, don't add it. We have hyssop and then a partridge pea, which is a native annual species that's really attractive, not only to pollinators, but to birds as well. Okay, so if you wanted to add a pollinator planting onto your property and you're working with NRCS, they would use wildlife habitat planting practice code 420. Anyone recognize this beautiful flower here on the right? Beesweed, very good. A+. Okay, so I think you all have this covered, but if you are looking for additional sources to find native plants in your region, the New York Flora Atlas is an amazing resource to use. I use it probably every day. The Biota of North American Program, so BONAP, is also a really great resource. We have the Eco-Regional Revegetation Application, so ERA is another great resource. The USDA Plants Database, it's definitely been revamped, I feel like, over the past couple of years. So if it's been a few years since you've been on the website, definitely check it out again. A lot of great information on there. The National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder is a fantastic resource to find out which moths or butterflies are using which plant as a host plant. So if you're really wanting to know, hey, what's going to enjoy my oak, go there and you'll see who's all enjoying it. And then lastly, Pollinator Partnership has eco-regional guides available where you just enter your zip code and it will pop up one of these and it will help you identify native plants for your region. And these are all free to download. And yeah, it's just pollinator.org/guides, #zip. Okay, so if you want to work with NRCS, you can either send me an email. So here's my USDA email. So lacey.smith@usda.gov, or you can contact your local NRCS office directly. So if you just, whatever web browser you use, just NRCS Service Center near me, and it'll pop up with a website similar to this. I think it's recently been updated, and you will select your state, and then you'll select your county, and then it will auto-populate information on who to contact via phone, email, and the office location. If you're wanting to work with NRCS, I would strongly recommend calling or emailing first before just showing up, because they're in the field a lot, so it'd be a shame you show up and no one's there, they're out in the field. Okay, so if you decided to work with NRCS, here's just a high overview of what happens next. So number one would be the planning. So this is where you discuss your goals with staff to create a conservation plan. If you like what you hear and you want to proceed onward, next step is application. So with help from NRCS staff, you will complete an application for financial assistance programs. Up next is eligibility. So NRCS will file the paperwork to ensure that you are eligible for assistance. Everyone is eligible for technical assistance, but financial is limited. Up next, after you submit the application, everything's been reviewed, is ranking. So NRCS ranks applications according to resource concerns. You get a higher ranking score, the greater the environmental benefit your plan is going to be. Fortunately, pollinator planting activities rank generally very well, so good chances, but if you don't qualify or if you're not selected for that year, they can forward your application to the following year. And then implementing is the final step. So if you are selected, they will contact you, and then you will get to sign the contract and begin the conservation practices. Typically, like of course, it's just a rough estimate. Whenever you submit an application and finding out if you qualify, or typically around a year. So don't get too excited. You might have to wait a little bit, but generally it all works out. All right, so summary. So pollinators provide vital ecosystem services to crops and wild plants. Over 80% of the blooming plants in the world require an animal pollination for successful reproduction. 38% of New York's native pollinators are at risk of extinction, and under worst case scenarios, 60% may be at risk. And bees and flies, not fleas, are at most risk. And we can support our native pollinators by removing invasive species, using pesticides responsibly, reduce deer browse, and select native plants that support pollinators and other beneficial insects. And NRCS offers a wide variety of conservation programs that either directly or indirectly support pollinators and will provide financial and technical assistance. And then if you have any questions about getting started with NRCS, or if you want help contacting them, feel free to contact me at lacey.smith@usda.gov or contact your local NRCS office to get started. And thank you for listening. Any questions? Yes.
In order to work with the USDA pollinator programs, are there minimum acreages required?
Yes, very good question. So so the question was, what is the minimum acreage required to create pollinator habitat with NRCS? And it's half an acre. Yeah.
Half an acre.
Half an acre. Yes.
How good are the local nursery farms that sell these things in bulk about making sure they offer native plants primarily?
Oh, so like native
nurseries and all, like nurseries where people are going and buying the stuff, right?
Oh.
How good are they at making sure that do you work with them and all?
I do not, no. I do try to keep a list of native nurseries that are found in New York and near New York. I have not worked with any of them directly, but from viewing their websites and internet sleuthing, they all seem very good. Yeah.
If I know there's some new people here, but we do have a native plant shopping guide, and we've checked all these plants through New York Flora Atlas and so on. And it tells for each plant which nurseries will be selling it. So that's, you can download from our website. It's under hgcoy.org, I think Project Shopping or something. So it's available for free and it's updated every year. And so it will tell you, it will tell you like where the nurseries are, landscapers that will work with you. And then for every plant that is sold, some of the native plants aren't sold anywhere, but it shows who sells it. So that's available every year. So all these nurseries here, and it tells whether they're, we don't put any cultivars in, only
very good.
and then if it's local ecotype, we do the elm. So this is updated every year for the trees, grasses, so on, and that's downloadable for free. Okay. Native plant shopping guide.
Yeah, everyone check out that source. Very good. Yes.
Is butterfly weed native to New York State?
It is. Or actually, well,
Not butterfly, not butterfly bush.
oh, you said butterfly weed though.
Yeah. I think it's weed. It's
You're talking about the milkweed, the orange.
orange, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, because no, not butterfly bush, no. But yeah, no, I'm pretty sure that one's native to New York. I think there's what, 4 or 5 native species of milkweed you can find in New York, maybe.
The one I mentioned is especially good for monarchs, adult monarchs.
All of them, they're all good for monarchs.
You know, it's funny. I used to live in Manlius, and I planted lots of trees, and we planted a lot of flowers that are great for pollinators and especially monarchs. And at first, this was about 7-8 years ago, I saw a few monarchs, and it got so I did not even see a single monarch.
Their numbers are severely down.
4 years in a row.
Yeah, they're in a lot of danger. Yeah, so anything we can do to support our monarchs is really beneficial right now, especially since they are struggling so hard. So like adding our milkweed, which is always important because that's the only plant that they can use to lay their eggs on, but it's also really important to provide other native flowering species that they can nectar on. So that way they can get all that sugar and nutrients for their long flight.
Get rid of the swallowwort.
Yeah, get rid of the swallowwort. Do not use a tropical milkweed. I know some people like tropical because it's a species that lasts a long time, but that's why we don't want it, because it can harbor a lot of pathogens because it doesn't die as quickly. So yeah, avoid tropical milkweed. If you're wanting to support native pollinators, choose native plants. Yes.
You hit milkweed in the wrong place. What's the best time to transplant it to a good place?
Ooh, so typically if I'm moving milkweed, I would like to do it either early in the spring or during the dormant season, so late in the fall.
So late in the fall.
Yeah.
There's still time.
Yeah.
If it's butterfly milkweed, you're not going to be able to transplant it. Okay. Because they have a huge pattern. So you're better off harvesting the seeds and plant them in the fall so that they over winter. But mark where you put them. Okay. Or cold stratified. Yeah, don't try and transplant. The other milkweeds.
That's what's so nice about butterfly milkweed is that it has that long taproot. A lot of people will like it because it doesn't spread as aggressively as common milkweed. So like it does seed, but it doesn't spread as aggressively. But I guess if you're letting the seeds go everywhere. But yeah, but if you're looking for a milkweed that's maybe a little more manageable, go for like the butterfly weed.
Or swamp milkweed, which is
easy
to transplant.
It is.
Great. It's beautiful.
It smells great.
It'll grow anywhere.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yes.
In reply to your question, in addition to the shopping guide that we have, I've actually been to almost all of the native plant nurseries, and the answer is the majority of them know native plants, but not all. I always go with my New York Flora Atlas on my phone and check out what I buy because they may not be accurate.
Yes. Oh, online questions.
Questions from online. First question is about specialist pollinators. How do they survive when most species have such a short bloom time?
That's why it's so. Oh, sorry.
Repeat it.
Okay, so the question was how do
specialist pollinators survive when most species have plants have a short bloom time?
Yeah, so they have a very short window that they are actually alive. And a lot of like their lifespan corresponds whenever their host plant is in a bloom. And that's why it's so important for us to have those native wildflowers available and to get rid of those invasive species that could be displacing these native wildflowers that have such a short bloom period that these pollen specialists are dependent on being there because they may only be alive for a few short weeks, and it corresponds with their host plant. So like they have it tough out there. So our pollen specialists, 25% of them are working hard out there. Not only do they have a short time window that they are alive, they have a short time window when their host plant is blooming, and they're also battling other competitions such as pathogens, loss of habitat, and so on. Yeah, climate change. Yes.
I was just going to say about climate change, researchers have found that there's a disconnect. There is becoming a disconnect between when the blossoming period, if it's advanced and the pollinators are not as advanced yet.
Yep.
They don't find the species that they need.
Yeah, it's going to be a definite challenge because even this year I've noticed I feel like plants were like in bloom a couple weeks before normal. And so for that pollen specialist that, they've always this year, at this time, and now that, the bloom periods are shifting with climate change, like they're going to have it much harder, and we're going to have to hope that they can adapt with it, but there's likelihood a lot of them won't. And so we're going to lose even more species, which is unfortunate.
Okay, one more online.
Yes.
How would you suggest getting rid of lesser
Celandine. Okay, so the question is, how would I recommend getting rid of lesser celandine? So I am not a certified pesticide applicator, so that's a question I cannot answer. Oh, pesticide. So it's kind of umbrella. So then, so I wouldn't. But if you go to Penn State, go whatever web browser you use, type in Penn State. Control of lesser celandine, and they have really handy fact sheets. But for the most part, it seems like they recommend pre-emergent herbicides. But of course, I'm not a pesticide applicator, so I cannot provide any recommendations. But definitely check out Penn State, and I would assume Cornell Extension probably also has some really nice fact sheets on covering control of lesser celandine. But Penn State has been my go-to for most of my years, just because it was closer to where I was from.